Minnesota Duluth. As coordinator of the Minnesota NRDAR program, Susan leads a team of scientists to assess injury to natural resources and assist with restoration planning. Prior to her current work, she led Superfund cleanup actions. That experience provided a strong understanding of chemical exposure and effects to natural resources. Susan lives in Duluth, Minnesota, and enjoys spending time outdoors, including boating on Lake Superior, fishing, gardening, and cooking. And if you're ready, Susan, I have your slides open and we'll share them. Just let me know when you want me to go to the next one.
I've got to unmute. Hello, everyone. As Rebecca said, I am Susan Johnson. I'm the coordinator of the NRDAR program in the state of Minnesota. I'm real honored to be here today. Wore my shirt. And I just want to say I did attend the DOI conference in person back in 2016 and found it a wonderful experience. So I hope we can get back to in person real soon. You can advance the slide. Okay, so I'm here today to share what has happened with the 3M settlement in Minnesota. So a little background on 3M. If you're not familiar with 3M, the 3M is actually an abbreviation and it stands for Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company. That is their corporate name. Their global headquarters is located in Maplewood, Minnesota, which is a suburb of St. Paul. In this presentation, I'm going to outline the PFAS problem in the East Metropolitan area of the Twin Cities. Describe our NRDA pre-litigation work phase, the lead up to the trial that actually didn't occur, and our implementation progress and challenges ahead. I think I will shut off my camera too, just for bandwidth issues. Okay, you can advance the slide. I'm sure most of you have some familiarity with the PFAS compounds, and if you don't now, it sounds like NRDA might be embracing PFAS coming soon with changes coming from EPA, so get ready. It is a large family of compounds that they're characteristically very difficult to break down and then can be very mobile in the environment depending on the compound structure, the chemical structure. So if it's a shorter chain compound, then it usually is more mobile than the longer chains. It is used in a variety of products, and I guarantee you have been exposed to PFAS compounds. 3M invented the PFAS compounds in the 1940s for their water and grease resistant properties. The 3M incorporated PFAS compounds in their own products, such as Scotchgard, and then distributed PFAS to other companies that were producing products such as Teflon pans and food packaging. PFAS is also used in large industrial settings, such as the plating industries as a surfactant and an additive in firefighting foam. A little note here about, not quite done, how we consider an exposure pathway for humans in the 3M context was humans were drinking contaminated water from municipal water supplies and private wells, and they were eating fish caught from water contaminated by various PFAS compounds, but PFAS in particular. And they were eating food grown and raised in places near where PFAS was manufactured. You can go to the next slide. First, let's do a little breakdown about the East Metro and what we mean by that. The East Metro is located in the east part of the Twin Cities. You'll see a map on the right side, specifically adjacent to St. Paul, Minnesota. It is bordered by the Mississippi and St. Croix rivers. Wisconsin is located to the east side of the St. Croix River. Within this area, there were 3 historical disposal sites and then also a 4th disposal site near the production facility. These are historical disposal sites that the 3M deposited waste in since the 40s. These are the main sources of contamination. Remedial actions started in the mid-2000s and continue on into today. There are current actions happening right as we speak. 3M voluntarily phased out the production of PFOS and PFOA in the last 20 years, but they are still manufacturing PFAS compounds. So when did this all start? For us, PFAS was discovered in the 3M production wells. So these are their water intake wells as part of their process. They disclosed that to the Pollution Control Agency and then initiated several investigations. In 2004, PFAS contamination was found in drinking water wells in the East Metro, and also the State Health Department issued PFAS health risk limits or standards for drinking water. If there was an exceedance of this standard in a well advisory would be issued, and temporary water supply, either bottled water or treatment, would be added to that well. In 2007, 3M and the state entered into a consent agreement that requires 3M to investigate and take remedial actions to address the release of PFAS from their disposal sites. Although the state determined that the PFAS exhibited hazardous characteristics and were in a position to make a bold statement that PFAS is a hazardous substance under state law, the agreement didn't go as far as making that declaration. So they didn't formally declare PFAS as a hazardous substance. This becomes very important later. It also required the 3M to provide temporary drinking water, mostly by groundwater treatment. You can go to the next slide. This is a map of the East Metro. Again, you see the Mississippi and the St. Croix rivers and the 4 disposal sites. You'll see what looks like a plume map, and there's different compounds of PFAS represented on this map. PFBA is a very short structure compound, and it is pretty much found everywhere in the East Metro. PFOA is more the green plume, and PFOS is the hatch plume. So the longer the chain gets, the less it migrates. There are some characteristics in the aquifers that are impacted, and there are 4 aquifers impacted from these waste streams. There's a bedrock fault running right down the middle, which creates a natural groundwater divide pulling to the west and the south in the Mississippi River and to the east for the St. Croix River. There are also groundwater surface water interactions throughout this whole area. To the north, you'll see a town called Lake Elmo. There was a flood diversion project in the 90s that rerouted water from this area through chains of lakes and sequences of underground connections out to the St. Croix River. So this has caused some migration, that big purple blob in the West Lakeland Township. And there's also groundwater pumping at the 4 disposal areas that are driving groundwater flow as well. So this whole area is about 150 square miles with a population of right now about 140,000 people. Everyone is drinking groundwater in this area. The city of Minneapolis actually pulls their water from the river, but not so much in the East Metro. There are over 100 lakes in Washington County, and the investigations have found extensive groundwater and surface water interactions. Okay, there has been a push to sample all the private wells, but again, there is some issues with capacity at labs, so there has been a little lag, but of the 3,800 wells sampled, almost half have well advisories. There's a priority pecking order as to if you live closer or down gradient from a disposal area, you'll be prioritized for sampling. All right, next slide. Once released into the environment, PFAS is soluble and present in the water column. It tends to be retained in soil and sediments as well. PFAS is taken up by plants and biota and then consumed by other organisms. Exposure occurs from surface water and sediments, mostly in the 3M case. PFAS tend to bioaccumulate and then biomagnify in exposed wildlife species, particularly in fish. For our NRDA work, much of our knowledge of the toxicity to wildlife came from literature and was very limited at the time. So this is the mid-2000s that we were beginning this work. The literature impacts included developmental, reproductive, immune system impacts, as well as neurological effects on wildlife. Several studies since our initial NRDA assessment work started in the area have supported the literature findings and show specific impacts to wildlife. A swallow study conducted by USGS in the Mississippi River area showed a correlation of higher contaminant levels to less successful nestling hatching. And a bald eagle study conducted by the National Park Service, they found PFAS in most eagles' blood. So that's concerning as well. A post-settlement risk assessment, so this was funded after 2018, conducted in that flood diversion area also showed that fish and fish-eating species are most impacted. Next slide. Okay, for the cleanup and NRDA efforts, the state relied on our state law, which is the Minnesota Environmental Response and Liability Act. That mirrors CERCLA in many ways. The state, as Rebecca mentioned, has two agencies designated as co-trustees of our state natural resources. That's Pollution Control Agency and the Department of Natural Resources. One of the differences between CERCLA and MERLA is the statute of limitations for NRDA actions. For MERLA, it's 6 years after the commencement of remedy construction. So it was determined, since there were some early actions in 2004, which we're going to go over a little bit, that determined the statute of limitation for the case was July of 2010. Next slide. I'll quickly walk through this timeline, which usually lags, the NRDA work usually lags behind the remedial timeline. And I say NRDA part 1 because there is a part 2. The purple items are Superfund actions and the blue items impact and inform the NRDA process. Based on the discovery of PFAS in drinking water wells, the 2004 emergency actions to mitigate contamination migration and provide temporary water treatment, that began our statute of limitation clock. The remedial actions of disposal areas and well testing expanded rapidly but could not keep up with demand, slowing the injury assessment for the NRDA work. In 2007, the Health Department issued the first fish consumption advisory for PFAS in the East Metro, which 3M contested. 2007 brought the Superfund agreement, the consent order for 3M to investigate remediation. There was an attempt from the NRDA co-trustees of the state to try to work cooperatively with 3M, do a cooperative assessment, but they refused. The state developed a preliminary estimate of injury and damages in 2010. And as the statute of limitations loomed, a real short tolling agreement was reached to extend the deadline till the end of the year. Next slide. The state generally does not conduct specific resource studies and instead uses available data to develop a preliminary estimate of injury and damages. The primary injuries were to groundwater as a source of drinking water and of fish consumption advisories. For groundwater, injury thresholds were based on exceedances of standards and the well advisories that were issued. An injury valuation was calculated using several economic valuation methods to create a range of damages. The fish consumption advisories were looked at both within the East Metro area and downstream on the Mississippi into the pools south of the East Metro area, as they are also packed with PFAS. That was our assessment area. We used a benefit transfer methodologies applied to lost fishing trips due to contamination. There was some restoration planning done at this time, such as gathering information from each of the communities about their long-term drinking water needs, but no specific projects were identified in this effort. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations ran out and the state filed a lawsuit against 3M on New Year's Eve, 2010. The claims were brought under our state MRLA law, other state statutes, including the Pollution or Water Pollution Act, which mirrors the Clean Water Act in most ways, trespass, nuisance, and negligence. Next slide, please. The state needed more assistance and resources as it sought outside counsel to assist with bringing the lawsuit. Covington and Burling had successfully negotiated for the state a global NRDA settlement with insurance companies for all the closed landfills in the state about 10 years prior. For this case, for the 3M case, Covington and Burling developed a new injury assessment and damage estimate using the current data. Because if you remember, it's been 8 years since we had started all this work. 3M did seek to dismiss this case several times, which ended up in the Minnesota Supreme Court. They ultimately failed. And so there was a delay of several years in moving forward. In the meantime, the state health department decreased the drinking water standards statewide, adding treatment to hundreds of homes and tens of municipal wells under the consent agreement. And 3M was not happy about that. By 2017, Covington and Burling utilized 11 expert opinions to complete their injury and damage assessment and prepared to have those experts testify at court. They were shared with 3M as part of the discovery, their expert reports. Those reports covered contaminant and fate, toxicity, effects on wildlife, estimated damages for lost drinking water services, and impact on aquatic-related natural resources. The estimated value was about $5 billion. The court date was set for February 20th, 2018 in Federal District Court. Next slide, please. In a very dramatic fashion, the case was settled, negotiated and settled over a holiday weekend prior to the trial starting. This settlement allows for the state to fundamentally change how we approach PFAS contamination and the East Metro area from which comes to provide clean drinking water. Until this settlement, the state had focused on Band-Aid approaches used to address immediate risk per the Superfund approach. This was a moving target because of the changing standards. With the natural resource damages settlement, we have an opportunity to look at the issue with a longer-term holistic approach to providing safe drinking water now and into the future. And just to note that 3M was still providing temporary treatment under the consent decree. There will be $720 million immediately available for these two priorities, and I'll go into those a little bit. There'll be limitations on how the grant can be used. So all this was included in the settlement agreement. The expectations for the affected communities to participate and recommending projects and identifying specific ideas. And it preserves the obligations under the consent order. Next slide. So out of the 850 million, 125 million went to Covington and Burling. And we had another 5 million in past assessment costs and other expenses. So that did leave 720 million available for restoration projects. Of the 720 million, at least 20 million must be used on the second priority, which is to enhance and restore natural resources that were injured by PFAS. The first priority would then have 700 million dedicated to enhance the quality and quantity and sustainability of drinking water in the East metropolitan area. Okay, next slide. So for priority one, in the East Metro, like the majority of Minnesota, groundwater is shared by both public and private drinking water systems. It is important that we consider the sustainability of this essential resource as we develop drinking water supply plan due to the expected population increase in the East Metro. this is the long-term portion of the planning. It's estimated that the population will grow by 25% by the year 2040 to 225,000 residents. Working with the communities in a specific work group, we developed specific goals for priority 1, and that's to provide safe drinking water for current and future conditions, protect and improve groundwater quality, protect and maintain groundwater quantity, and minimize long-term cost burdens for the communities. In the terms of the human context, contaminated drinking water is a primary concern for many citizens. It's been front page news lately. Relationship between risk and injury is very blurred for the public, and it is a challenge to communicate the benefits of the NRDA settlement. Understanding the community's concerns and needs was paramount in this NRDA settlement, as well as assuring all residents that they're drinking safe water now and into the future. Next slide. The state decided to develop the conceptual drinking water plan. I would relate that to more or less a restoration plan. There was certain questions that we needed to answer with this plan, and then consider all these answers of each community and how they answer these questions. And then with all those answers, we had to consider how to line all those up to fit into one plan. Questions like, is additional infrastructure needed? We did consider moving the water supply source to surface water. As some of you may know, that surface water has much more corrosive chemistry than groundwater, and additional infrastructure would be needed, and we'd have to hook up every household in this area, which more than half are on private wells at this point. So ultimately, moving the supply to surface water was too expensive, and we did not pursue that any longer. Is there enough water? Is the water source sustainable, and how does it affect the aquifer? Is there excessive drawdown? And there has been issues with this in the past in this area. Does it require treatment? Where is treatment needed and where is it not needed? And then there's always the notion of changing standards, and that complicates the question. Okay, next slide. So it took 3 years for this state to develop the plan. So we have a conceptual drinking water plan. It has many accolades to this plan. It has a comprehensive approach. So we have a plan for each one of the 14 communities and how their water will be delivered to their customers, whether it's a private well or a municipal well. Addresses not only what comes out of the faucet, it also addresses the source of the problem, the contaminated groundwater. Safe and sustainable. It provides safe drinking water by meeting drinking water standards for now and into the future, and I'll explain that in a minute. It ensures the continued access to drinking water without causing localized water availability issues. It is a resilient plan. It builds treatment for wells beyond those exceeding drinking water standards. It includes wells that are at or greater than half the current standard. So it goes above and beyond what would be required by remediation. It creates resiliency in the system by having treatment in place already proactively addresses changing health values. And it's more cost effective to build systems with the future in mind. So we know, and we didn't know this in 2018, that the standards may change or the designation of PFOS and PFOA might change to a hazardous substance. We didn't know that then, but we built in this resiliency into the plan. And it's very flexible. All these projects are community driven, which mean the plans provides fundings of certain projects that the cities are interested in, and they can adjust to accommodate to their own individual preferences, and they have more flexibility if there's cost overruns. So each community basically has their own little bucket of money. Okay, next slide. The plan promotes three priorities. There's capital infrastructure costs, both for private well owners, and they may have the need for an in-home treatment system on their individual well, or it could be an individual or neighborhood connection to municipal systems. For municipal wells, there'd be new treatment facilities, new wells to replace heavily impacted wells, interconnections between communities. And then there's a O&M component. So this is operation and maintenance. We didn't want to burden communities with long-term O&M. So this ensures that systems being built can be operated in the future, and there's costs and funding provided for that. And then drinking water protection, which actually addresses the source. We haven't started on the drinking water protection portion yet, as a lot of the investigations are still ongoing. Next slide. So the plan allocates the $700 million into various categories. There's the capital cost category, which is the majority. Costs for operation and maintenance, which projected to be about 20 years of O&M. There is a drinking water protection category. And then there is the contingency, which can be moved into any one of these categories as needed. We're already seeing the effects of inflation on building costs, and the projections we made even last year are now we're running into cost overruns with scoping these very large water treatment plants. So inflation does have impacts, that's for sure. To date, we've spent $32.3 million on a few projects. We did do some early restoration work, I would call it. There was a few communities that were replacing wastewater lines and were ripping up their roadways. And since the road was already removed, they asked that the settlement lay down their main water supply lines when they're adding new neighborhoods to their municipal source. So we did do a few early projects along those lines. Next slide. Here's an example of some of the metrics we have and what we were planning on achieving with the plan. A note about communication of the settlement. So the settlement does have its own web page, settlement.state.mn.us. We've developed a residence guide to the drinking water supply plan. It's like in a flip book format that's on the web page. It lays out for the residents that all residents have safe drinking water today and into the future. That's been our key message all along. It was the goal of the settlement to have this type of transparency throughout the whole process. Once the settlement funds are expended, another message we wanted to relay to them that the Superfund consent order will still be in place and 3M will still need to provide safe drinking water issues to these communities. Next slide. Adaptive management. There has been and continue to be a number of successes and challenges developing and implementing this plan. Both its nature and complexity and its size and reliance on technical information. To incorporate the challenges ahead, we all know what those challenges are: the changing health risk values from EPA and potentially a designation of PFAS and PFOA as hazardous substances. The plan offers a process to review progress, spending, and potential reallocation of funds. We're running into cost overruns due to, inflation, as I mentioned. The population estimates have also changed in about a 2-year time frame, gone up, of course. The fact that it took 3 years to complete this plan meant continuous updates on data, migration, and standards, and feedback from communities. This resulted in somewhat of a moving target with new information during this entire process. It was a challenge to balance putting together a well thought out plan to provide these communities and a water supply in a timely manner that they could start implementing projects. Future unknown conditions bear heavily on the settlement and its endurance to provide safe drinking water. Okay, next slide. So now that the drinking water supply plan is in progress, implementation is moving forward. The state has turned its attention to priority 2. This is the enhanced natural resources and recreation restoration opportunities. In general, the results of the injury assessment showed that basically the impacts are less wildlife and therefore less wildlife for people to observe and consume. Priority 2 is intended to replace, protect, enhance these natural resources and services have been lost. And we're really just getting started on this work. So we haven't gotten real far. Go to the next slide, please. But here's the fundamental differences between priority 1. Priority 2 is not limited to 14 communities that were impacted in the groundwater injury assessment. The state looked at to include communities on both sides of the Mississippi River and impacted areas to the north. The state of Wisconsin is bordering the St. Croix River, but was not part of the settlement. So there will be no funds going to the state of Wisconsin. We will take a different approach from working directly with communities that identified projects to seeking a public solicitation process. We hope to engage other governmental and nonprofit organizations that represent restoration interests on a regional and watershed scale. The settlement funds are considered non-public funds, so we are hoping to leverage additional grants that may require a non-public source for a cost share. We plan to let these funds within 2 years and hope to have the projects implemented within the next 10 years. So more to come on this story. Next slide. Oh, that's the end. This was a high-level presentation and 4 years of post-settlement work. However, there has been about 20 years of work that's presented here today with the communities and the understanding their needs now and into the future. I'll just say I wasn't a part of the NRDAR program till 2015, so I did miss some of that build up to the trial, but the day that it settled was a very happy day for all of us. And let's still remember 3M is still manufacturing PFAS compounds, so always something more to keep an eye on.
Well, thank you, Susan. This was just an amazing presentation, showing us an example of NRDA at a state level, and seeing those parallels with those state and federal laws is really interesting, I think. In 20 years, I think a lot of people on this call can relate to that time frame, more or less. And it was really interesting to see the drinking water aspect because, as you probably know, federally, we can't go that route usually. So that's why we need you guys in the state. Some great work here. Appreciate you sharing. And at this time, if there's anybody that has any questions, please raise your hand or drop it in the chat and I'll ask her. We've got Lisa asking, are the NRD related expert reports prepared for litigation available?
Yeah, I figured that question would come up. We're looking at it on a case-by-case basis. So if you have a request to see the reports, you can email myself. Rebecca, do you have the slide? I think the next slide is actually the list of reports.
Nope.
Oh, it's at the bottom. It's a hidden slide. See it? There it is. So that's the list of reports. But go ahead and contact me, and we'll work with you to see if we can release all our specific reports. So
that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, send it on over to us, and we'll make sure it gets out. Does anybody else have any other questions? Getting a lot of great jobs in there. That was great work. John's asking, have there been an epidemiological studies in the region looking at potential associations between PFAS exposure and incidence of cancer rates or other linked conditions?
Yeah, so that's the Department of Health that is in charge of that work. They are looking at, as they say, cancer clusters and what the correlation is with PFAS. They're also doing a blood monitoring study, so you can volunteer to have your blood drawn, and then they'll follow your health history as that moves forward. So yes, there has been those kind of studies.
Okay, thank you. Lisa's now saying for NRDA request for proposals, are you focusing on shovel-ready projects? And she says we sometimes provide phased funding for project design, feasibility studies, then reevaluation by trustees before providing implementation funds.
First, yeah, for the RFP, so I feel like we're going to get a variety of things, but we are open to funding project design, feasibility studies, even potentially some water and fish tissue sampling, because we certainly don't want to promote additional access to fishing if it's a designated do not eat the fish lake, you know, if that makes sense. So there could be some pre-project work if they want to apply for it in phases. We're not ruling that out.
Okay. Then next, Molly's asking, did industrial economics do the groundwater damage assessment?
Minnesota works with Apt Associates for I'll say the part 1 portion. I believe Covington and Burling worked on with IEC for their portion. They didn't share a lot of their documents except these expert reports with us. I think they needed them for the economic side of things.
Yeah, it has on this table here, HIA next to IEC. So are there any other questions out there? We do have time. If not, we can move on. Emily's dropped Susan's email in the chat. I'll put it on the screen again for another second if anybody wants to write that down, if they have more questions. And we'll see if we can get those reports out to the bigger group that are allowed to be shared. So thanks again, Susan. This was great. Really, really appreciate your time and all the effort with this project. This is amazing. I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah. And then Rebecca Stevens, are you ready?